The stage lights burned hotter than the sun, and Jake's heart thundered louder than the crowd's applause ever could. At 19, he stood at the edge of his dream, an audition for a groundbreaking LGBTQ theater production in New York City, a chance to tell stories that mattered, stories like his own. But as he stepped toward the stage, his father's cruel words from that morning echoed. "You're broken, Jake, just like your life." He could still feel the sting of the fall, his father's deliberate shove as he'd rushed out the door, the crack of his ankle against the porch step, the searing pain that shot through him. His father, a man of iron fists and rigid beliefs, had loomed over him, sneering, "No son of mine will prance around in some queer show." Jake had limped to the audition anyway, his ankle throbbing, his spirit bruised but unyielding. The director's pitying look when he stumbled through his lines hurt worse than the injury. He didn't get the part. Now, 6 years later, Jake Parker stood in the heart of Manhattan, staring up at the marquee of the Belasco Theater. His name glowed in bold letters, Jake Parker in shades of us. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same city that had once rejected him now celebrated him, but the scars of that day, of his father's cruelty, still lingered. He adjusted his scarf against the October chill and stepped inside, where the hum of anticipation filled the air. Tonight was the premiere of his one-man show, a raw, unflinching exploration of identity, love, and survival as a gay man in America. It was his story, poured into every line, every gesture. Jake hadn't spoken to his father, Richard, since he'd left their small Ohio town at 20. The memory of that final fight still burned. Richard's bellowing rage, the hurled beer bottle that narrowly missed Jake's head, the ultimatum to fix himself or get out. Jake chose the latter, scraping by in New York on diner tips and sheer grit. He'd found solace in the city's vibrant LGBTQ community, in late-night talks at Stonewall, in the arms of strangers who became family. But the wound of his father's rejection festered, a quiet ache that fueled his art. Backstage, the mirror reflected a man transformed. At 25, Jake was lean and striking, with dark, tousled hair and eyes that held both fire and fragility. He wore a tailored navy blazer, a nod to the polished performer he'd become, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. The weight of the night pressed against him, not just the performance, but the knowledge that Richard was out there, somewhere, unaware of his son's triumph. Or so Jake thought. The house lights dimmed, and the crowd hushed. Jake took a deep breath, his ankle, long-healed but still prone to twinges, grounding him in the moment. He stepped onto the stage, and the spotlight found him. "This is for anyone who's ever been told they're broken," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "This is for us." The first act was a whirlwind of memory. Jake's childhood in Ohio, the suffocating weight of his father's expectations, the secret crushes he buried under fear. He moved fluidly across the stage, embodying every character. His younger self, his mother's quiet resignation, Richard's towering rage. The audience leaned in, captivated by the raw honesty of his words. Jake spoke of his first love, a boy named Caleb from high school, whose stolen kisses behind the bleachers had felt like rebellion and salvation. He spoke of the audition that broke him, the fall that wasn't just physical but a shattering of hope. As the act closed, Jake stood center stage, his chest heaving. "I thought I was broken," he said, his voice cracking. "But broken things can still shine." The audience erupted, and Jake felt the weight of their applause like a lifeline. He glanced at the wings, where his boyfriend, Ethan, stood watching. Ethan, with his warm blonde hair and steady presence, was Jake's anchor, a reminder that love could heal what hate had torn apart. But as Jake bowed, a figure in the back row caught his eye. A man, older, broad-shouldered, with a familiar scowl. Richard. Jake's heart lurched. His father was here, in the audience, watching the son he'd disowned. The room spun for a moment, but Jake forced himself to focus. He had 5 more acts to get through, and he wouldn't let Richard's presence unravel him. Not tonight. Backstage during intermission, Ethan found him, his hand slipping into Jake's. "You okay?" he asked, his green eyes searching. Jake nodded, but his mind was racing. Why was Richard here? Had he come to mock, to judge, to drag Jake back into that old pain? Or was it something else, something Jake couldn't yet fathom? The second act called, and Jake returned to the stage, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let his father's shadow dim this moment. This was his story, his truth, and he would tell it with every ounce of his soul. Jake's voice carried through the Belasco Theater, weaving a tapestry of pain and resilience. The second act plunged into his early days in New York, a city that had both embraced and tested him. At 20, he'd been a stranger to himself, navigating a world where acceptance came with a price: sleepless nights, empty wallets, and the constant fear of failing. He recounted his first job at a Greenwich Village diner, where the clatter of plates and the hum of queer voices became his refuge. "I was a kid from Ohio," he told the audience, his tone wry but warm, "thinking I could conquer New York with a duffel bag and a dream." The crowd chuckled, but Jake's smile faded as he described the loneliness that followed. The city was freedom, but it was also rejection, auditions that ended in polite smiles, landlords who demanded rent he couldn't pay, and the nagging voice of his father in his head: "You're broken." On stage, Jake transformed into the characters who'd shaped him. He became Maria, the trans barista who taught him to laugh through heartbreak, her voice a lilting mix of sass and wisdom. He became Leo, the drag queen who slipped him free drinks at Stonewall, preaching self-love between sets. These were the people who'd stitched Jake back together, piece by piece, when he'd felt like shattered glass. But the heart of the act was Ethan. Jake's voice softened as he described their meeting. A rainy night at a poetry slam in Brooklyn, where Ethan, a painter with a crooked smile and a gentle soul, had read a piece about finding beauty in chaos. "He looked at me like I was whole," Jake said, his eyes glistening under the stage lights. "And for the first time, I believed I could be." The audience sighed, some wiping tears, as Jake reenacted their first date, a nervous walk through Central Park, hands brushing, hearts racing. Yet the shadow of Richard lingered. Jake caught glimpses of his father in the audience, his face unreadable but unmoving. Why hadn't he left? Jake pushed the thought aside, focusing on the story. He spoke of the moment he'd decided to write Shades of Us, pouring his pain into a script that became his salvation. The process had been grueling. Late nights hunched over a laptop, rejection letters from producers, the fear that his story wasn't enough. But Ethan had been there, reading drafts, offering coffee and courage. As the act neared its end, Jake paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "This city didn't just give me a stage," he said. "It gave me a voice, and I'm not done using it." The applause was thunderous, but Jake's eyes flicked to Richard. The man hadn't clapped, hadn't moved. His presence was a weight, a challenge Jake wasn't sure he could face. Backstage, Ethan was waiting, his arms open. "You're killing it," he whispered, pulling Jake close. But Jake's mind was elsewhere, tangled in questions. "He's here, Ethan," he murmured. "My dad. He's in the audience." Ethan's grip tightened, his voice steady. "Then show him who you are, not who he thinks you should be." Jake nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. The third act loomed, and with it, the part of his story he'd dreaded most, confronting the abuse that had shaped him. He'd written it to heal, to reclaim his power, but with Richard watching, it felt like bearing his soul to a blade. He took a shaky breath and stepped back onto the stage, the spotlight both a shield and a spotlight on his vulnerability. The third act opened with a memory Jake had buried deep, the night he came out to his father. At 17, he'd sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he confessed who he was. Richard's response had been a fist slamming against the table, a roar of "No son of mine is like that." Jake's voice broke as he recounted the months that followed: silent dinners, locked doors, the constant threat of violence. The audience was silent, gripped by the weight of his words. He spoke of the audition again, the moment that had defined his breaking point. "My father didn't just trip me," Jake said, his voice raw. "He wanted to crush me. But I got up. I'm still getting up." The crowd erupted, some standing, their cheers a wave of affirmation. Jake felt their love, their strength, but his eyes found Richard again. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Jake saw something flicker in his father's face: regret, perhaps, or defiance. He couldn't tell. As the act closed, Jake stood tall, his chest heaving. "You can't break what's already been rebuilt," he said, his voice ringing with defiance. The lights dimmed, and the crowd roared, but Jake's heart was a battlefield. Richard was still there, and the story wasn't over yet. The third act had left Jake raw, his emotions laid bare under the unrelenting spotlight. As he stepped into the fourth, the stage felt like a confessional, each word a step toward reclaiming his truth. He spoke of rebuilding himself in New York, of finding love and purpose, but also of the shadows that lingered, self-doubt, fear, the echo of his father's voice. Jake described the moment Shades of Us was greenlit. After years of rejection, a small theater in the East Village had taken a chance on his script. It wasn't Broadway, he told the audience, a wry smile tugging at his lips, but it was mine. He recounted the sleepless nights of rehearsal, the fear that his story wouldn't resonate, the exhilaration when it did. The show had started small, but word spread, and soon, producers were calling. Now, here he was, at the Belasco, living a dream his father had tried to crush. He shifted to Ethan's role in his journey, painting a vivid picture of their life together. Their apartment in Brooklyn, cluttered with paintbrushes and scripts, was a sanctuary. Jake described quiet mornings, Ethan sketching while Jake wrote, their laughter filling the space. "Love doesn't fix you," Jake said, his voice soft but clear. "It reminds you that you're worth fixing." The audience sighed, some reaching for hands beside them, and Jake felt a warmth spread through him. Ethan was in the wings, his presence a steady pulse. But Richard's shadow loomed larger now. Jake could feel his father's eyes on him, a silent judgment that threatened to unravel his focus. He pushed forward, diving into a memory of his mother, Ellen, who died when he was 15. She'd been his quiet ally, slipping him books about art and identity, whispering words of encouragement when Richard wasn't listening. "She saw me," Jake said, his voice catching, "even when I couldn't see myself." He spoke of her funeral, where Richard had forbidden him from crying, calling it weakness. The audience was silent, the weight of loss palpable. As the act progressed, Jake's tone grew fiercer. He spoke of the broader fight, the LGBTQ community's resilience in the face of hatred, the victories won through protest and pride. He wove in stories of friends, Maria's struggle for acceptance, Leo's triumph over addiction, the countless others who taught him that survival was an act of defiance. "We're not broken," he declared, his voice rising. "We're unbreakable." The crowd roared, a wave of applause that shook the theater. Backstage, during a brief pause, Ethan pulled him aside. "You're doing it, Jake," he said, his hands framing Jake's face. "You're telling the truth." Jake leaned into him, drawing strength from his warmth. But the question of Richard gnawed at him. "What if he's here to hurt me again?" he whispered. Ethan's eyes were fierce. "Then you show him he's already lost." The fifth act called, and Jake returned to the stage, his heart a tangle of hope and fear. He spoke of the moment he'd learned to forgive, not his father, but himself. "I spent years hating the boy who fell," he said, his voice steady. "But that boy got me here." He described the therapy sessions, the late-night talks with Ethan, the slow unraveling of shame. The audience leaned in, their silence a testament to his power. As the act closed, Jake paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. He didn't look for Richard this time. "This isn't just my story," he said. "It's ours. Every one of us who's ever been told we don't belong." The applause was deafening, but Jake felt a quiet shift inside him. He was no longer performing for his father's approval. He was performing for himself. The fifth act was Jake's reckoning. The stage, now a battlefield of memory, glowed under the spotlight as he dove into the heart of his story, the cost of survival. He spoke of the nights he'd doubted himself, the auditions where he'd faltered, the moments when his father's words, "You're broken," felt like truth. But he also spoke of triumph, of the community that had lifted him, of the love that had grounded him. He recounted a pivotal moment, the first preview of Shades of Us in the East Village. The theater had been small, the seats half-filled, but the energy was electric. "I stood on that stage," Jake said, his voice vibrant, "and realized I wasn't just telling my story. I was giving others permission to tell theirs." The audience had wept, cheered, embraced him afterward, strangers sharing their own scars. That night, Jake knew he'd found his purpose. He shifted to Ethan's unwavering support, describing a moment when doubt had nearly consumed him. After a brutal review called his work self-indulgent, Jake had wanted to quit. Ethan had sat him down, handed him a coffee, and said, "Your story isn't for them. It's for the kid in Ohio who's scared to be himself." Jake's voice softened as he spoke Ethan's words, and the audience felt the weight of their bond. In the wings, Ethan's eyes glistened, his pride palpable. But Richard's presence gnawed at Jake. He hadn't seen his father move, hadn't heard him react, but the man's stillness was its own kind of violence. Jake pushed forward, speaking of the broader fight for acceptance. He told of pride marches, of standing shoulder to shoulder with thousands, of the joy and defiance that fueled them. "We're not just surviving," he said, his voice ringing. "We're thriving." The crowd erupted, some standing, their cheers a wave of solidarity. As the act neared its end, Jake paused, his breath steadying. He spoke of a letter he'd written to his father but never sent, pouring out years of pain and anger. "I didn't need him to read it," Jake said. "I needed to write it. To let go." The audience was silent, hanging on his words, and Jake felt a weight lift. He was no longer the boy who'd fallen. He was the man who'd risen. Backstage, Ethan was there, his arms a haven. "One more act," he said, his voice soft but fierce. "Finish it." Jake nodded, but his mind was on Richard. What did his father want? Why had he come? The questions churned, but Jake pushed them aside. The final act was his chance to close this chapter, to reclaim his story once and for all. The sixth act opened with Jake alone on stage, a single spotlight illuminating him. He spoke of the present, of the life he'd built. "I'm not broken," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I'm whole, and I'm here." He described his dreams, writing more, loving fiercely, building a world where no one feels less than. The audience leaned in, their silence a testament to his power. Then a shift. Jake spoke directly to the crowd, his eyes finding Richard's. "To anyone who's ever tried to break us," he said, his voice unwavering, "we're still standing." The theater erupted, a standing ovation that shook the walls. Jake stood tall, his heart pounding, as the lights dimmed. He'd done it. He'd told his truth. The final act was Jake's triumph, but it was also his reckoning with the past. As the spotlight found him, he stood center stage, his presence commanding, his voice a beacon. He spoke of the future, not just his, but the one he wanted for everyone. "We don't just want to survive," he said, his tone fierce. "We want to live, to love, to be seen." The audience was with him, their energy a pulse that matched his own. He recounted the journey to this moment, the years of struggle, the small victories, the love that had carried him through. He spoke of Ethan, of their plans to marry, to build a life that honored their truth. "He's my home," Jake said, his voice soft but resonant, and the crowd sighed, some wiping tears. In the wings, Ethan stood, his smile a quiet promise. But the shadow of Richard loomed. Jake had avoided looking at his father, but now, as the act neared its close, he couldn't ignore him. He spoke of forgiveness, not for his father, but for the boy he'd been. "I used to think I needed his approval," Jake said, his voice steady. "But I don't. I never did." The audience cheered, their applause a wave of affirmation. Then, a moment of vulnerability. Jake paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "This show isn't just for me," he said. "It's for every kid who's been told they're less than. For every heart that's been broken but still beats." The theater was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Jake felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. It was part of his truth. As the act closed, Jake took a deep breath. "We're not broken," he said, his voice ringing. "We're beautiful." The crowd erupted, a standing ovation that shook the theater. Jake bowed, his heart full, as the lights dimmed. He'd done it. He'd told his story, and it had set him free. Backstage, the crew swarmed him, their hugs and cheers a blur. Ethan was there, pulling him close, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." Jake clung to him, the weight of the night settling in. But one question remained. Richard. As the crowd dispersed, Jake saw him, standing alone in the lobby, his face unreadable. Jake approached, his heart pounding. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Richard's eyes, so like Jake's, flickered with something, regret, perhaps, or shame. "I saw your name," he said, his voice gruff. "In the paper. I had to see." Jake waited, his breath held, but Richard said nothing more. No apology, no explanation, just silence. Jake nodded, a quiet strength settling over him. "I hope you saw me," he said. "Really saw me." He turned and walked away, Ethan's hand in his, leaving Richard behind. The past couldn't hurt him anymore. He'd built a life stronger than his father's hate. The theater was empty now, the echoes of applause fading into silence. Jake stood outside, the October air crisp against his skin, Ethan's arm around his shoulders. The marquee still glowed with his name, a beacon of everything he'd fought for. He'd told his story, and the world had listened. But the encounter with Richard lingered, a final note in a symphony of healing. As they walked through Central Park, the city humming around them, Jake felt a quiet peace. He thought of the boy who'd fallen, the boy who'd risen, the man he'd become. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. Jake smiled, squeezing his hand. "More than okay," he said. "I'm free." They stopped by a bench, the same one where they'd had their first date. Jake leaned against Ethan, the warmth of his body a reminder of everything good. "I thought seeing him would break me," Jake admitted. "But it didn't. I'm stronger than that." Ethan kissed his forehead, his touch a promise. "You always were." The next morning, reviews poured in. Shades of Us was a triumph, critics calling it raw, radiant, and revolutionary. Jake read them with Ethan over coffee, their laughter filling their small apartment. But one letter stood out, slipped under their door. It was from Richard. Jake's hands trembled as he opened it, Ethan's steady presence beside him. The letter was short, the words halting. "I was wrong," it read. "I don't understand you, but I saw you tonight. You're not broken. You never were." No signature, just those words, scrawled in a hand Jake recognized. He stared at it, tears blurring his vision. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was something, a crack in the wall his father had built. Jake didn't write back. He didn't need to. The letter was a weight lifted, a door closed. He tucked it away, not as forgiveness, but as proof that he'd won. His father's words no longer defined him. His story did. Years later, Jake would stand on bigger stages, tell more stories, love more fiercely. Shades of Us became a movement, inspiring others to share their truths. Jake and Ethan married in a small ceremony in Brooklyn, surrounded by the family they'd chosen. Richard never reached out again, but Jake didn't need him to. He'd found his own light, his own strength. As Jake looked out at the city that had shaped him, he knew this was his karma. Not revenge, but resilience. He'd turned pain into power, hate into hope. And in that, he was whole.